Hello, hello, Brian Goulet here of gouletpens.com, and this is episode number 73 of Goulet Q&A, my weekly video slash podcast that I do answering your questions about fountain pens, paper, ink, all that good kind of stuff. Today is April 3rd of 2015, and feeling good. Spring is coming, weather's getting warmer outside, not quite warm enough for me to ride my bike in the mornings like I like to do. I get about 6 months a year doing that. If it's below 45 degrees, it's really just too cold for me to be comfortable riding outside. So I'm excited to be able to do that again in the mornings. I can still do it like during the day, but not in the mornings. So let's see here. It's been pretty busy this week, as always. We're going to be trying something pretty new here. We've got, we were doing the math, and it was like, we have all these Q&A videos, and they're really great. We've done a lot of good content, but a lot of the questions we've gotten have been really good, just kind of like standalone questions, but they got kind of buried in like an hour-long Q&A. So we thought, why don't we extract them out of an individual, compilation kind of Q&A and make them their own smaller, more referenceable videos. We can put them on the website on product pages. We can link to them on the blog and so on. So I think it would be really helpful to have that. We can do hyperlinks to products and stuff like that. That's something new that we're doing through YouTube now. Direct links in the videos to get you to your product pages. So just trying to make things a little easier for you. So we're going to be experimenting with that. We've been pulling out some questions here and there. Margaret and Madigan have been doing a great job kind of combing through old blog, old Q&As and stuff. Jenny's been helping out a lot. She's been putting them together, composing them really nicely. We haven't started pumping them out quite yet, but we are going to be doing that soon. So I'm excited to see how everybody responds to that. It should be kind of fun. Emmett's joining me here today, by the way. He's helping me out, supporting me. But anyway, so the thing that we're struggling with, just to be quite honest, is like what to call these individual videos. We're thinking about calling them like pullouts or, little Q&As or FAQs or something like that. I don't know, but the idea is they're individual, questions that are pulled out of the bigger Q&As that we can make into their own video. So I don't know, maybe you got some insights about what they should be called. Appreciate that if you can hit it up in the comments. We'll keep brainstorming about that. We got a few new things that have been coming out lately. The Jinhao 159 has come out in a yellow and an orange, and I'm just now realizing I don't actually have one on my desk to show you, so I'm sorry, you'll have to go to our site, check that out. Got a video about that on YouTube. I think we're still waiting to do the written blog post because we just haven't had time to draft it. There's been so much stuff going on. It's been crazy. I think I'm actually the holdup on that one. But anyway, so that is kind of cool. It's the big $12.50, 50 gram heavyweight 159. It's pretty cool. And then did a video on the top 7 power pens, which was really kind of a silly video. It was kind of fun, and I just kind of felt like doing it. And it seemed to have gotten some good engagements. It's also, I believe it is the most disliked video that we've ever put on YouTube. It's got like 20 downvotes or something like that at this point. But I was kind of asking for it. I was being, pulled out a little bravado on that one. So I was really just trying to goof around, have some fun. I've done so much like educational content on here, which is really great, and I'm not going to stop doing that. But every now and then I just like to mix it up a little bit, and the nature of that video was just kind of so goofy. I just kind of felt like having fun with it. So that was kind of neat. And then we got a bunch of new stuff that's going to be coming down the pike. We're going to have the Lamy Neon Lime Safari that's going to be coming out, the special edition for 2015. That's going to be coming pretty soon. We got some other pens that we announced in our newsletter this week, so more of that will be coming. Specific timelines may shift and stuff because stuff's coming in, starting to overlap. We're having a big push to try to even just get them photographed and get the content out there, get it on the site, and make it look really good. We got a pretty hands-on approach to the way we do stuff here at Goulet, so we have to kind of stage things out a little bit just so that we don't end up overlapping and kind of causing chaos in our own office. So we're working on that, but there'll be a lot of good steady stuff coming out for the next month or so. So it should be pretty fun. Got a bunch of good questions this week. Got a lot of questions. We're getting like 45 to 50 questions every week this week, which is really cool. But it does mean that I just am not going to be able to answer the majority of the questions. Margaret's been helping me out a lot. A lot of the questions are coming in through Facebook, but we got some good ones from Twitter this week too. Got a couple from YouTube, so it's been cool. So Margaret and Madigan are helping me kind of answer those questions because despite the best of my intentions, I would love to circle back and answer those questions on the platforms where you're asking them that I'm not able to do in the Q&A. My schedule has not allowed me to do so. So I'm really sorry about that, but they have been helping me out tremendously there. And I am talking with them, advising them, and helping them in that way. So, we're still finding a groove. We got a, pretty newly formed media team here, and we're working on doing that. It's hard to be all places at all times, but we're finding our groove. So anyway, for the questions this week, I'm going to kick it off with the pens and writing category. Got a few questions here. And the first one, Matt L. from Facebook. Out of all the nibs you have ever tried, which is your favorite? And I kicked it off with this one, and honestly, I'm going to give you kind of a cop-out answer, and that would be that I really don't have one favorite nib. I really don't. I've used so many different pens, and honestly, like when I first got into fountain pens, it was all stub or nothing else. I only wanted stub nibs because I had a very narrow kind of scope of how I was using my pens. My handwriting was not very great. The calligraphy nibs really helped my handwriting look a lot better. I'd never had a calligraphy type look before because I was coming over from the rollerball world, so it was all stub for me. I wanted nothing else. Then, as I realized stubs have their place and sometimes they're not as practical, then I started to get more into just like mediums and broads. I was using them pretty exclusively on like Clairefontaine Triomphe and stuff as I was writing the handwritten thank you notes in the early days of the Goulet Pen Company. And so I was really gung-ho about big, fat, heavy, broad, wet nibs, which I still love, but certain types of notebooks, certain situations, that is not as practical either. So now I'm learned to appreciate much more some finer nibs. So honestly, like over the years, I've gone from like stubs to broads, mediums, and I've kind of gone finer. And now, like honestly, I carry a pen case with at least 10 pens in it because I like to have a variety of nib sizes, ink types, filling mechanisms, and all that. I really like to have a good spread. I got a lot of pens at my disposal, and so I like to have a variety. So I'm really learning to appreciate all of them. So that's my total cop-out answer. But if you really put me in a corner, I mean, I would have to say, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but my blue Pilecki Custom 74 with the medium nib, I do love that nib a lot. Really, I'm a big fan of all the Pilot nibs. They're really, really great. I just am really digging Pilot lately. The Pilot Custom 823, I have one of those with a medium nib. It writes so well. It just really, all the Pilots write really great. So I'm really digging those. I'm also a big fan of the Lamy 2000 with my medium nib. I like it. It's a little bit broad for some of the notebooks that I use it in, so I don't always use it. I probably should get a fine or an extra fine with that, which then it tends to get a little bit more hit or miss. The sweet spot gets a little finer, but the medium nib, I really like the feel of that as well. So, those, if I had to, just based on what I just naturally tend to grab, what I gravitate towards, that would be it. But there really is no like one nib that's like, this is the nib that is the standard for all nibs. There really are a lot of good ones out there. So that's my answer. Next question I have, Chris R. from Facebook. What gives a nib its number size, and what does the size tell us about the writing experience? I was looking at the Pelican M1000 and thinking that it's a lot of extra expensive material. Well, that is an incredibly expensive pen, and it does have a really big nib. The size of the nib, though, isn't the only thing that determines the expense there, and that's not what I'm going to focus on this question as far as Pelican pricing and stuff like that. That pen is very expensive, pushing $1,000 for that pen. It's very expensive. But what gives it its number size? So I think what we're talking about here is not like fine, medium, broad, but we're talking number 6, number 5, and so on. The measurements has to do with, let me see if I have a nib here. I think I have one laying around. I know I just had it a second ago. I just like pushed a whole bunch of stuff out of the way when I was organizing. Okay, of course now I can't find. Here we go. Okay. No. All right. So I have a nib here, and the nib itself just looks like such, okay? The nib, you usually only see kind of the top portion that's sticking out, but there is more that obviously goes into the pen and kind of holds it in place. The measurement has to do with kind of this back portion right here. If you measure from one side to another, that measurement in millimeters determines its size. So a number 6 nib is a 6 millimeter nib at that measurement. A number 5 would be 5 millimeters there. So the smaller the number, the smaller the nib size, and then so on. So the bigger you go, the bigger it is as well. So That is the correlation as far as I understand it. Now there's all kinds of other proprietary designs and stuff like that. Not every nib is this shape. So there's really all kinds of different other factors. So that's basically the general rule though. The higher the number, the bigger the nib. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to write better or worse. It's only one, it really only determines the size of the nib, and that's about it. There's all the factors that can go into a nib size, and I'm looking at my notes here because there's a bunch of them. The springiness of the nib, like how much bend and flex there is to it, can affect how it writes. The flow of the feed, actually, nothing to do with the nib, but the feed itself that is supported under that nib can vary from pen to pen, and that can make a difference even with the exact same size, like a number 6 nib. You put that number 6 nib in a Jinhao versus a Monteverde versus a Noodler's, it's going to perform very differently just because of the feed and the design of the pen, even with the same nib. So that, it comes into play as well. The smoothness of the grind, so the actual tip itself, how smoothly is it honed? How well it's tuned, so the adjustments of the tines, you know, up and down, and also the grind and stuff can make a difference there. How well the slit is cut in the middle and whether that has been flossed and all that kind of stuff. The material that the nib is made of, whether it's stainless steel, whether it's gold, whether it's titanium or palladium and all that, that can come into play. The shape of the nib, like you can grind the wings down and you can shape and shave off some stuff on the underside to add flexibility and stuff to that. That's getting into some real fine-tuning stuff that pretty much is like custom nib grinder, Nibmeister type work, but that can make a big difference in how well something writes. And then even the slit of the nib, like the length of the slit, like if you look at the Noodler's number 6 nib, which I think I have one right here, but you can't see it anyway. But that slit goes way down there, and that adds to the flexibility of the nib as opposed to other ones which will just kind of stop right in the middle. So there's really all kinds of factors that can come into play. So just having a number 6 size nib, it really only tells you how big the nib is. It doesn't necessarily mean much of anything else. Sue M on Facebook asked, does the length of the nib make a difference in the writing experience? I've noticed that I have one nib that is much longer than the others, and that pen is especially tiring to write with for any length of time. Okay, and this question really kind of overlaps a little bit with Chris's question about kind of the overall size. Now you're talking about the length of the nib. Technically the number measurement has to do with the width of the back part of the nib, but that will usually correlate with the length of the nib too. Okay, so that's where the overlap happens. But what you're talking about here, and the reason I took your question, Sue, and I wanted to focus on it a little bit, because you talked about it being tiring to write with for any length of time. When you have a larger nib, with longer, larger, whatever, usually that's going to come in a larger pen. Larger pens are usually heavier. The heavier the pen, the more fatiguing it's going to be for your hand when you're writing with a long period of time. So that's where this question is leading. I think the pen that you're using might be too heavy for you, or there may be a way that you're gripping it that is not ideal for your hand and you're getting cramping and stuff like that. Now, one tendency that I have, and I'm going to use this pen. This is actually a knitted fountain pen that a customer fan sent me, which is pretty cool. I don't know if I busted this one out before, but I've got it sitting on my desk. It's pretty awesome. I'm probably going to get a lot of questions about this. But anyway, I'm going to use this as an example because it's very easy to see. But when you're holding a pen, if you hold it too upright, too close to the nib, and you bear down too hard, as if you were writing with a ballpoint pen, that's where you're going to get a lot of hand cramping. With the fountain pen, you loosen up a little bit, you drop your pen angle, you push with much less pressure. You really should almost be able to write with just the weight of the pen itself. Your hand is only gripping the pen so that you're keeping it in the proper orientation. You're really not pressing down as you're writing, okay? So I'm kind of getting away from original part of your question about the length of the nib because I don't think that is necessarily what's causing your tiredness in your hand. I think it might have something to do with the way that you're holding the pen or the weight of the pen itself may be causing you to have some fatigue. So I think that might be where you want to focus on. Try a couple different pens and see if that might make a difference. You can have a pen that's like 50 grams like a Jinhao that has a number 6 nib, or you can have a pen like the Edison Beaumont, which both of those pens I featured in that top 7 power pens video. The Beaumont is only 16 grams, uses the same size nib though, and I think you would find you'd have a very different writing experience with those 2 pens. So that I think is really where you should focus on, is how you're holding the pen and maybe the weight of it. Okay, Sue? But I hope you can get that worked out, because writing, having a pen not tire out your hand is one of the benefits. Having it not tire out your hand is one of the benefits of using fountain pens. So I hope you can help get that figured out. Next question. Vlad Yarotsky on YouTube. What are your thoughts on ink rollers or ink balls? Why are so little of them made? Does any manufacturer offer different ball sizes, exchangeable tips, yada, yada, yada? You have lots of questions for me, and I will kind of focus on what I know about them. Yeah, some things that I know a little bit less about, but I'm going to focus on just kind of a general covering of ink roller balls. So refillable roller balls is what I usually tend to call them. I think they're okay. They're not my favorite. They have their place. They have their pros and their cons, okay? Some of the I'll touch on your first question, which was, or kind of some of the stuff like you asked about what ink is suitable for them. Okay, I actually didn't talk about that yet, but that is one of your questions. What ink is suitable for the refillable roller balls? You can basically use whatever you want. The drier the ink, the more troublesome it tends to be. So I would stay away in general from the non-lubricated permanent inks, like some of the Noodler's Eternals and stuff can get they can tend to dry out a little bit and not operate so smoothly. It's best to stick with lubricated or just wetter writing inks in general, maybe not specifically like advertised as lubricated, but wetter writing ones. So the Noodler's Eel series is lubricated, Monteverde's is lubricated, the Pilot Roche Zuku aren't advertised as lubricated, but they are pretty smooth writing. Diatramentis has a lot of smooth writing ones, and a lot of diamine. Some of those can be hit or miss because of how saturated some of the colors are. You'd want to stay away from some like probably Ancient Copper and Diamond Pumpkin, and some of those that tend to have a little more particulate that settles in the ink bottle, but some of their more conventional colors would usually flow pretty smoothly. They tend to be pretty wet, so maybe check those out. But in general, the benefits of a refillable roller ball, one is that you get to use your fountain pen inks, your favorite inks. So that is a benefit. They will usually write drier than a fountain pen, okay? The roller balls will. So you may want to account for that. If you're used to the way that a certain ink looks in a fountain pen, particularly a broader nib size, going to an ink roller ball, you may notice it writes much less saturated, much drier. That's just the nature of the roller ball itself, not quite as smooth flowing as a fountain pen. Okay, it's not going to dry out as quickly as a fountain pen. So a fountain pen, if you leave it sitting out for a long period of time with the nib exposed, ink is mostly water. So ink is the water is going to evaporate off of that nib, and eventually it's going to dry out. I mean, it can happen fairly quickly to the point where you need to kind of get it started again. It can happen, even within a minute on some pens, some inks, where if you leave it uncapped and you're just kind of sitting in a meeting, whatever, you pick it back up, and you might have to kind of get it going again. An ink roller ball is going to be a little bit better than that, so you don't have to necessarily be quite as diligent about capping and recapping your pen as much with a refillable roller ball. And then the last thing is that it's easier to bear down, especially if you're using on like carbonless paper, carbon copy paper, whatever, something where you need to press through multiple sheets. That's a lot easier to do with a roller ball than it is with a fountain pen. But there are some drawbacks too, okay, and I'm not going to ignore those. So they don't write as smoothly as a fountain pen. They still have a roller ball, so that you're going to feel more friction. You're going to feel that roller ball mechanism possibly moving around inside the pen a little bit, so it just doesn't feel quite as responsive as a fountain pen would. It can leak, and it's got some of the, inking and cleaning, maintenance, I guess, of a fountain pen. I'm not saying it will leak, but I'm saying it can, because it's still using a very liquid ink, whereas a gel roller ball would be less inclined to leak. It's got the same wear and tear as a regular roller ball. So a regular roller ball, you're usually using that ball, and then when the cartridge runs out, you throw it out and you get a new one. So you're essentially getting a new ball every time that you replace it, and you're kind of like amortizing, I guess, the cost of those tips with each cartridge that you're buying. With a refillable roller ball, you're saving a little bit of money because you're not having to replace the cartridge every time you go to refill it. But at the same time, those rollerball tips are going to eventually wear out, so you're going to need to replace them. Some of the tips, depending on the brand you're going for, can be quite expensive. You know, I never used the Visconti Eco Roller, but I want to say the tips are somewhere around $20 or $25 to replace. That's a lot of money, you know what I mean? That is no small commitment, and the pen itself is over $100. So it can be, you know, I don't even know if they still have that pen anymore now I think about it. I think I remember hearing something about it being discontinued. I don't know, but I know that was one that was talked about a couple of years ago. I really haven't heard much about it lately. We only have a couple refillable roller balls on Goulet pens, but there's only a few models to choose from. They are pretty rare. There's not a lot of them. I don't think they're incredibly popular because they have, you know, they in some ways they're the best of both worlds between a rollerball and a fountain pen. In other ways, it's the worst of both worlds. So it's kind of, you know, you take it for what it is. The last thing is that there's a limited tip size option. With a fountain pen, you can get extra fine, broad, whatever, calligraphy. With a refillable rollerball, you usually only get one choice with whatever brand you're going with. There's almost never a multiple, you know, tip choice option. And especially like the broader you go, the harder it is to get a ball that really writes and holds up well. So that's really kind of tough. And then the narrower you go, the scratchier it's going to feel, and it's not going to flow as smoothly. So it's just, it's tough. You pretty much end up with some kind of medium tip on those roller balls. All right, now let's go to ink questions. All right, and I got a couple ink questions for this week. One question. Edith N on Facebook asked, if a highly saturated ink has the tendency to dry in the nib and cause flow problems, even when a pen is used daily and capped when not in use, does it make sense to try to dilute the ink with distilled water? Or is the tendency to dry in the nib unrelated to the concentration of dye? That's a great question, Edith. It's actually very directly correlated. So the more dye that you have in your ink, the more of a tendency it's going to have to dry out in your pen, generally speaking. There are other factors at play in terms of ink formulation and stuff like that. There's lubricants that can be added and all that stuff, but just purely talking from a dye concentration standpoint, dye is drier than water. The more that the water, the lower the concentration of water, I guess, the higher concentration of dye, the quicker it'll dry out. Now, how scientific you can get with it, I don't really know. I don't know anything about the concentrations or anything. It's really subjective. It's just like, basically the bolder and more like deeper and more saturated the color looks on paper, you can kind of gauge that an ink is more saturated than another one. And that's really the only gauge we have, because ink makers don't publish anything about their levels of dyes that they use or concentrations or anything like that. All that's proprietary information. So you end up kind of having to just guess as to whether something is saturated or not, based on your own experience, what you're feeling, what you're seeing. But I will kind of speak just in major generalities. When you're using inks that tend to be more saturated, there's going to be a little bit more of a tendency for it to dry out in your pen quicker than those inks that are less saturated. And I imagine a lot of that is due to the fact that it's just more watery, okay? So if you wanted to dilute your more saturated ink colors, such as Private Reserve, Noodlers, those such inks, you would probably notice a difference in how quickly it would dry out in your pen. On the positive side, the more you dilute it, the longer it would take to dry out, because you have more water. So there's more water that would have to evaporate out of the ink before it would dry up. Are we making sense here? I think so. It's best probably to start with a like 10% dilution. I don't think for the highly saturated colors you would notice much of any of a color shift or the shift in saturation by going just about 10% distilled water to 90% ink. And in fact, Noodlers, you know, Nathan Tardif is all about economy and, you know, cost effectiveness. If you hadn't gathered that from his packaging and the way that he bottles his stuff, he fills up his bottles like to the brim. Technically, I think the bottles that he uses are actually 2-ounce ink bottles that are intended to be filled, you know, only to a certain level, but he fills them to the brim to make them 3-ounce bottles. So when you open up a Noodler's bottle, it is literally like you can't fit any more ink inside that bottle. And he super concentrates dyes in those inks. And so part of that is because he believes that you should get the most bang for your buck, so he gives you the most ink possible in the smallest container possible, and he really does that. So he actually encourages people to dilute the ink if they want a less saturated form. So it's very different than most other ink makers. Most other ink makers don't want you to mess too much with their stuff. Some of them will blatantly put stuff on their ink bottle saying, don't mix this with other inks, etc. You know, but Noodler's is not like that at all. He's all about free choice and people doing whatever the heck they want. So for his stuff, for Noodler's, I would say if you want to buy Noodler's and dilute it, go for it, because it's really made for that, you know, with rare exception. So that I strongly encourage you to do. It's best to use distilled water because there's no contaminants or minerals or anything like that. If you don't really care so much about that, or you're just mixing it in really small quantities just to kind of see how it works, you don't necessarily have to be as diligent about that. Distilled water is not too hard to come by. You can get it at most grocery stores. So it shouldn't be too bad. And it's like, you know, maybe $2 for a gallon of it, which would last you forever. But anyway, that is my advice. And if 10% dilution is not enough for you, you can go a little higher, go to 15, 20, 25%. Tends to get much more desaturated at that point. Kurt G on Facebook, are certain types of inks a bad idea depending on the nib size? I found that some waterproof inks tend to clog my fine and extra fine nibs. Okay, this is a good one to kind of piggyback off the previous question. It might not be necessarily that it's waterproof. It might just be that some of the properties of the ink, like the dye concentration, may have a tendency to dry out a little bit more, especially on the fine and extra fine nibs. There just isn't quite as much that's flowing through there. You know, it's a smaller tip size, so it's a little bit less contact that the tip is making with the paper, which is going to draw less ink out, because ink works by capillary action. So the bigger, the broader the nib you have, if you're going with something with a flex nib or a broad or a calligraphy nib, like a talc stub nib of some kind, you're going to have more ink that's flowing through that pen, because the capillary action is going to be a stronger pull for that ink to come down through the pen. So if you're using a fine or an extra fine nib, it's just not going to pull as much ink down through the pen. So that's what I think is probably more what's going on. The ink just isn't flowing as much, so it's actually more of an ink drying issue than it is necessarily something to do with your waterproofness. So that is kind of what I would say about that. And then there's other things that can come into play too. The design of the feed of the pen. So it could just be like the particular pen or pens that you're using. The feed is not quite as wet and gushing as maybe some other ones. So that could be part of it. The paper that you're using too could also be a factor. So that again has to do more with the capillary action. If you're using a paper that is more absorbent, it could do one of two things. It could actually help to draw the ink down more and help to keep it flowing well. Or if you're using a very fibrous paper, which can be absorbent, you actually might be getting some like paper fibers and stuff up in your nib, which is causing restricted flow. So it might not have anything to do with your ink at all. It could be that those fine and extra fine nibs are scratching the paper a little bit more, which is causing more paper fibers to get jammed in there, thus restricting your flow. So you see how complicated all this stuff can be. It can be all interwoven. That's why it's important to have really good pen maintenance. You know, clean out your pen regularly. Even if you're using the same ink, it's a good idea to do it every 2 to 3 weeks. Ideally, wait no more than a month is what I like to say. I haven't been as diligent about that in the past, and I pay the price every time. And then I have to do a full detailed cleaning if I let it go more than a month, because then the ink dries out in the pen and blah, blah, blah. I know the same old story, and I'm ready for it every time. But if you clean out your ink a little more regularly, you're going to notice just a little bit better maintenance of the pen kind of ongoing. And it's not going to be as much drama. It's not going to take as much time to clean. So check that out. And the last thing is, you know, sort of piggybacking off of, let's see here, Edith's question that I just answered. If you want to, you know, take your ink, if it's really saturated and you want to dilute it a little bit, almost knocked Emmett over. If you want to dilute it a little bit, then you might actually be able to have less of a problem with the ink drying out on your fine and extra fine, or just any nib in general, and you're going to have a little bit smoother operation. So that may be something you want to play around with too. Always try diluting it in small quantities first before you do it with the whole bottle of ink to make sure you really like it. All right, now I've got one paper question this week, a lone paper question, and really it's kind of an interesting one. Emily W. on Facebook says, what are some fountain pen friendly envelopes in larger sizes, such as A6, A7, A9 perhaps, just something larger than the typical A4 and 5 or business envelopes. I'm thinking something that will fit greeting cards, invitations, etc. Okay, so I'm going to have to clarify something here about your question, Emily, because you said in larger sizes, such as A6, A7, and A9, those are actually smaller than A4 and A5. The way that paper measurements work, with the A sizes, the larger the number you go, the smaller the paper it actually is. So an A4 is like a full tablet size, right? Like this is an A4 size. An A5 is half of that. So A5 is actually half of an A4. An A6 is half of an A5, okay? An A7 is half of that, and so on and so forth. So when you're asking for larger envelopes, we're actually kind of moving away from the A system. And so I'm going to point you to a really great page on Wikipedia that explains all this visually as well as with specific measurements about paper sizes. So literally you could just Google paper size and pull up the Wikipedia article because it's going to come up at the top. But I've got a link to it in the comments so you can check that out. The comments on the blog. But you can check that out. The envelope measurements are actually what they call a C. There's an A format of sizes, which is the common like European standard. There's a B alternative measurement size, which is not used as much, a little bit more in Japan. And then there's a C, which is what's used for envelopes. So the envelopes that are typically associated, at gouletpens.com, we really only have two types of envelopes. Ones that are made for like the A4 size paper, the other one is for like the A5 size paper. And it's kind of confusing because the A5 size is a bifold. So if you take an A5 piece of paper and you fold it in half, that's about the size of the A5 envelopes that we have, which is technically a C6 measurement, okay? And if you, again, go to that Wikipedia page, you'll see what C6 is. I don't have the exact measurements here, but I think it's 110 millimeters by 220 or something around there. And if you go to the A4, it doesn't actually correlate exactly to a C measurement. It's somewhere between a C5 and a C6. So it's kind of confusing a little bit in that way. It's essentially the same height as the C6, the A5 size envelopes. I can just tell how confusing this is as I'm saying it. And it's a little bit longer. So what that is made for is a tri-fold. So if you're taking a full A4 size sheet of paper and you're folding it over twice into 3 parts, then that's made to fit in those A4 size envelopes that we have with Clairefontaine Triomphe, with Goulet Verger de France, and original Crown Mill. I think those are the only envelopes that we have at the moment. What you're asking for things like you know, that's the informative educational part of this question. The back half of this question, I'm going to totally just like drop the ball for you because I don't have anything like what you're asking me for. You know, larger sizes or different things for greeting cards and invitations, that kind of thing. I don't have any of that stuff. That's really getting outside my wheelhouse, so I really can't even touch on that. You know, the brands that we carry, like Crown Mill, Goulet, those get into more of that, the thank you card, greeting card, invitations, all that kind of stuff. They have a lot of that, but that's really not our wheelhouse. So we just don't even go there. Sort of like getting into planners. Like we have a couple, but we just don't really go there because we don't know what we're doing. So with greeting cards, invitations, all that, we don't know what we're doing. Yes, it's still paper. You would think it's not as complicated, but it's really a whole different use of paper than just like handwritten correspondence. It gets into a whole other design element, and there's all kinds of other factors, and it's just something we've never gotten into, so I just won't go there. So you're gonna have to find a different source, and I don't even have a great place to point you, I'm sorry to say, other than maybe go searching with Crown Mill or Goulet, trying to find a little bit more about that. But you're gonna really need to go more of kind of like the DIY route of maybe like looking at some stuff on like The Knot or like other places where there's like a lot of invitations and people are making stuff to find some more information about that. All right. Got a couple of personal questions this week. Question from Karissa D on Facebook. I got your videos. I go to your videos when I don't know something, or when I need something I don't know. I know your question, the grammar is throwing me off a little bit. Where do you get your information from when you don't know something about fountain pens or fountain pen adjacent? So essentially, when I'm not a resource, where do I go to find my information? And that's a really good question. I have never really been asked it quite that directly before. So I was really kind of happy to take this one. And it's not going to be a super simple answer because I've amassed quite a bit of knowledge in my own brain. So if I'm not able to spew it off the top of my head or reference my own stuff that I've worked on in the past and I just kind of need to refresh my memory, it gets kind of cloudy as to where I get it, and it really depends on what I'm looking for too. So if you can give me 1 second to take a sip of my water, I will explain further. Okay. So for me, yeah, it's going to depend wildly depending on what it is that I'm trying to figure out. And the best bet, my number one, best bet is to actually get my hands on it. I've used a lot of different products. I have a lot of good information. If I can get a pen in my hand, I can tell you more about that pen than probably most information will be published about it. Unless it's something like where is the pen made or something like that. But I can pretty much tell you the size of the nib. I can tell you how it writes. I can tell you how it flows. I can tell you, the filling mechanism. I can pretty much tell you all the different parts and how they're made, generally speaking. So I can tell a whole lot just by getting my hands on some stuff. The tough part is when I get asked questions about products I don't have or I've never seen before in person. Then I'm looking at pictures online, which is hard to tell if it's not standardized and our pictures aren't really good, or if the information, if it's coming from another country and it has to be translated and stuff like that, information gets really cloudy. So what I always like to do is try to get official info. It helps that I'm an authorized retailer for all the brands that I carry. So if I get a question about some Lamy pen that I don't know anything about, yes, I can do Google searches, all that kind of stuff, but the most reliable information I'm going to be getting is directly through my distribution chain. So I'm going to go to my distributor or direct to the manufacturer and say, hey, can you tell me about this pen? Where is it coming from? What is this piece of information? There's a lot of confusion about it. I'm getting questions about where this is made or what colors coming out or blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of rumors flying around. Can you tell me the real deal so that I can stomp out the rumors and put out the facts? That is definitely an advantage that I have as a retailer / blogger, is I can get official info. And I've built that kind of trusting relationship with all the manufacturers we've worked with so that I can get that information in usually somewhat of a timely manner. Sometimes the information is not easily found or is proprietary and I can't share it. Some people ask about formulations and chemicals and stuff that are used in Noodler's inks, and Nathan doesn't share any of that. So there can be some of that stuff is I literally just don't know because I'm not told that information, even if I specifically ask for it. Yeah, that's usually a great source for me to go to. And so I'll often say, I don't know, but let me find out. That's what I'm doing. And it can take a while to find some of that stuff out sometimes, depending on what it is. If it's just product use stuff or just preference information, reviews and opinions, what is the weight and the balance of a pen? How smooth is the nib? A lot of that stuff can be very subjective. So I will go to, social platforms, Fountain Pen Network. I'll reach out to our customers. We'll go to my customer care team and I'll ask them, say hey, are we getting a lot of emails about such and such a pen? I feel like there's a lot of activity going on Facebook about this pen. What are you seeing coming in from the chats and phone calls and emails and stuff like that? So I'll try to crowdsource information if it's something that I haven't used myself. Or if I have used it myself, but it's a pen a flex pen or something like that, where it's I might use it one way, a lot of people use it a different way, and I'm kind of how are people using it? Let's try and gather as much information as we can. So that helps a lot. And then getting information from trusted bloggers and reviewers and stuff like that. People that have got decent amount of blogging under their belt. Stephen Brown's got a lot of great videos. I really trust his judgments, and he's got his own style, definitely, just like I do, in terms of how he reviews things, his preference. He's going to hold his pens a certain way and write a certain way. So, I always have to interpret that a little bit. Not everything he puts out is fact. Not everything I put out is fact. There's a lot of opinion, a lot of subjectivity that goes along with reviewing products that you always have to take into account. Aziza as well, Matt Armstrong, Pen Habit, Liz Steele for Diatramente's document inks, a lot of artistic kind of stuff. Hudson Valley Sketches has been a good blog for ink washing and different ink properties, light fastness, all that kind of stuff. And so there's all kinds of other ones. Genty and Osmond, drawing with a squirrel. I know I'm rattling these off a lot. I'm going to put them all on the blog, so refer to the blog post about that. But you know, these are just things that are off the top of my head. People that I know have done stuff just from kind of being around for a while. And you know, the amount of content they put out is going to ebb and flow. Like, I'm a blogger too. I know life happens and stuff is going to change, and your taste will change, and your focus will change, and your life situation will get different. And so all that stuff kind of comes into play in terms of the amount of content they put out and how much they're reviewing and how much time they're able to put into certain reviews. So you have to take all of that into consideration. But the ones who are posting pretty regular stuff, you can look at, you know, 5 or 10 of their posts and tell whether they really kind of know what they're talking about or not. So that's kind of in general. But basically, you know, there's a lot of others that I'll kind of reference from time to time. I can't name everybody here. There's definitely been some that have kind of come and some that have gone, some that are recent, kind of up and coming. But it's really just like who's actually using these things and what do they have to say about it. So if it's a brand new product and it's something that is just, there's just not a lot of information out there, sometimes I just have to rely on whatever is there. So it'll literally just be like a Google search. If I get a question about some pen that I've never heard of, that usually means to me that it's like discontinued, not made anymore, it's some exclusive somewhere else in the world, and it's just not anywhere around here. It's a brand that I just have nothing to do with, like Montblanc or Visconti or something like that, and there's no way I could really be in the loop about that. Or it's something brand spanking new, and it is legitimately the first I'm hearing about it. You might actually be surprised how much a new product announcement comes from the Fountain Pen Network or somebody's blog in Southeast Asia, and it's like some test market that a worldwide brand did in one store in, you know, Hong Kong or something like that, and somebody just happens to go by, take a picture of it, throw it on the Fountain Pen Network, boom, all of a sudden the whole world knows about it that day. And then all of a sudden we're getting questions about it, and I'm like, what is this pen? You know, what is this pen? What is this ink? Whatever it is. And then I'm going to my distributors, I'm like, can I order this? When is this coming? We're getting questions about it, and they're like, we weren't even supposed to talk about that yet, or I didn't even know about that. You know, it's like, you'd be amazed sometimes how quickly information can spread throughout the world with the internet being what it is today. So a lot of times it could be just, I see some little blog, some tweet, some whatever, Instagram, whatever it might be, and I only have but so much information to pull from. I have to interpret a whole lot about it and go and start asking a lot of questions. So there's a lot of detective work that kind of goes into it. So in that respect, it's kind of fun. But you know, really, I guess the short answer is there is no one source that I go to. There's lots of different places that I will go to get the information that I need to. And you can tell just from my spewing this stuff out that it's usually a pretty exhaustive process that I go to try to get the best information that I can. And even then, sometimes it's not dead accurate, you know what I mean? Sometimes I'll get a pen in and I'm like, oh, you know what? I was told that it's this way, but this is actually kind of different. Somebody missed the mark on this one. And it happens, you know, it's human beings that are in the process here. So anyway, so that's about it for that. Another personal question. Ted S. on Facebook asked, where are you in your reading of the Bible, and what do you think of it? So this is a very personal question, right? This doesn't even have anything to do with pens at all. So I mentioned kind of just briefly a couple of times that I was doing, you know, reading through the Bible all the way through. I am Christian, and you know, that's something I get asked about from time to time. I really, it's not like I'm not very evangelical, so I try not to make it like that big of a deal. I respect a lot of people's different views and stuff. That's really not what I was going for by taking this question. It was a huge commitment of time and energy for me to go through this project, so I just want to briefly touch on it just because I did kind of tweet about it a little bit, and I did mention it in a couple of Q&As a ways back. So for me, it was a very personal project. I had never done it all the way through. Excuse me. Talking a lot on this Q&A. It was a very personal project. It was just a personal decision that I had to do it. You know, my son has like a little condensed. My son's 5. He's got a little condensed like kids version. It's like 104 stories of the Bible for kids. So he actually likes to read those. So we read like 3 little stories every night. That's been our routine, gosh, for about a year and a half now. I mean, he like. Excuse the pun, he religiously likes to read that book. For some reason, he's really latched onto that one, and I'm like, okay, I don't mind that. we read through that, and so I'd kind of been like reading like the very condensed kind of kids version of, you know, the whole story of the Bible, like all the way through. And I'm like, oh, this is kind of neat, you know, like some of these stories I remember here and there, but it's like hearing them in context and a little more of the storyline, I guess, of the whole thing. The storyline jumps around quite a bit at certain times, but there is kind of a flow to things. And I was like, yeah, okay. And then I actually had, you know, a customer reach out to me who's a missionary and said, hey, I just felt it on my heart to challenge you to read the whole Bible in a year. And I was like, you know what? I think I'm ripe for it. I think I'm ready. And of course, you know, being who I am, doing it in a year was just going to take way too long. So I decided to really get gung-ho about it. It took me a little while to kind of figure out how I was going to do it exactly because, you know, I have 2 young kids, this business, everything, life is crazy for me to try to fit in reading a project of that magnitude into my daily schedule is very challenging. But I read a lot of books, and I like audiobooks. I listen to audiobooks while I work out. I listen to them a lot of times, you know, if I'm in the car, if I'm showering. I mean, literally, like I can listen to them anytime. It just kind of helps my mind, you know, go. And so I've been doing that for a while. You know, I've listened to probably at least 40 different audiobooks in the last year and a half. So I really like that way of doing it, and I've literally been like practicing how to absorb content through audio. So that was kind of the preferred method for me. I really felt a calling to pursue that route. There's not a lot of audio versions of the entire Bible. So the one that I settled on, though, that was you know, the best produced and what ended up working out really well for me. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but it's an app called Word of Promise. It's the New King James Version, which is not necessarily my preferred version, but it was, you know, that it was what they had, and it was overall, you know, a good version, so I have no complaints there. Obviously recognize there's like a zillion different versions of the Bible that you could read through and I interpret for a deeper study, but I was really going for a highlight kind of overview of the whole story. So the thing I liked about the Word of Promise, it's an app. It's an actual app on the phone. So it has all the text there, and it kind of follows along as you're listening to it in the text. So that was really nice. I would like put the kids to bed, and I'm kind of like unwinding before I like open up my laptop and start answering emails at night, because I do that. And so I was like, as kind of just like mentally like, you know, settle down from the day, I would just kind of pull it up, you know, eat an apple or an orange or like whatever little snack, nighttime snack food that I would have as I kind of settle in after I make the kids' lunches. And then I would just kind of like read along as I listened to it. That worked out really well for me for you know, 30, 45 minutes. And then I would kind of listen to it while I worked out. And other times I really just kind of like worked it into my life. And I didn't really have like a super specific timeline. I thought it would be kind of cool if I read it within 90 days because that, to me, was a good pace for being kind of fully immersed and keeping with the whole story. If I spread it out too much, I would have a hard time remembering what happened 6 months ago when I read something. So I wanted to kind of go through it quickly. I did that. I ended up reading the whole thing in 68 days. I started on January 1st. And then I finished on, what was it, March 12th. So 68 days. It was very fast. I realized that. I know I didn't get a deep study, a deep understanding of everything. That's not what I was going for. I was really just going for a fast pass through the whole thing so that I could get the 50,000-foot view of everything that happened and then start to piece together like, oh, this is where that story comes in, or oh, this is actually referencing that happened a while ago, and being able to put some pieces together. So to summarize my whole experience of going through it, I would say that it revealed to me very much firsthand, the more you know you don't know. Okay, so of course, going through it like that, I was like, oh my gosh, like there were certain parts of it where I was like, I don't even understand what just happened. I know I'm going to have to read. And for a lot of the books, I would actually read like summaries of the whole book, you know, like page-long summaries that were in my like paper version of the Bible. And I would read through summaries and stuff, just so that I can understand like some context of who wrote it and what time frame and what, you know, because some of the time frames, especially towards like the older like New Testament books, time frames really start to jump in and overlap, and there's multiple time frames going on in a single book. So it kind of gets confusing from like, it's not like you read it cover to cover and it's like the beginning starts and then there's the end. There is a little bit of that, but you know, there's a lot that happens in between, so it gets a little confusing like that. And I fully realize like, oh wow, I'm gonna need to study this for like the rest of my life to even have any grasp on what the heck is going on. You know, reading it's one thing, understanding it's another. There's a lot of stuff that I do understand better. There's a lot of stuff that I'm even more confused on before, which I think is just part of how it goes. But I would say, like, in general, I absolutely accomplished my goal with it, which not only was to just read it quickly and to understand kind of the whole picture, but it was also to just, for me personally, I feel like I needed to read the whole thing so that I would have a familiarity with it all and understanding, you know, and understanding of the timeline, some of the contexts, how some of the books relate to each other, you know. And so for me, that I absolutely got that. So now when I pick it up, when I read a verse, when I go into a book and go to study it, it's like, okay, I feel like I don't feel like I'm like starting from scratch. I feel like I'm revisiting something that I'm already familiar with, and that helps me a lot, even just mentally, for going back and diving in deeper. Now to some business questions, shifting gears a little bit here. Samuel S. on Facebook, from what I gather, you guys carried some Kaweco pens, and then you stopped carrying them, and then started carrying them again, a few pens at a time. So far, though, it's all sports. What about Kaweco's other pens that would fit the Goulet Pen Company niche? So, yes, let me give you a little bit of context here. Okay, so yes, we did used to carry Kaweco, classic sports, ice sports. That was pretty much it. We had some other variations of the classic sports. The thing is, though, the way that we used to carry them several years ago, the distributor that was carrying them, that was like their only fountain pen in the whole lineup. And they had shared with us that like they sold 99% ballpoints and ballpoints and roller balls and pencils, and fountain pens were something they really just didn't understand. So we had a hard time communicating to them like what fountain pen people wanted. So they would bring in products from Kaweco in Germany to the US, but they only brought in medium nibs, and they only had some colors and so on and so forth. They didn't have like the full lines of anything. And I know from special ordering some stuff from Kaweco, their minimums are fairly high. You know, you have to buy things. They don't sell just the nibs by themselves. You have to buy like the whole grip section if you want to swap out nibs and stuff like that. And back then we were actually swapping nibs. So we were buying all the medium nib versions of everything in the US, and then we would special order just the nib grip sections of other pens from Kaweco in Germany. But it would take like 3 to 4 months to get these things in. It was almost impossible to actually keep them in stock and track any kind of trend of demand and stuff like that. And people got really frustrated. The nibs were really hard to pull out of the pen, so it was very taxing for us to pull them out and put them in and stuff like that. We did it for a while, but after a while, it was just like, this is just not worth it. Like, honestly, it just was too logistically challenging. We weren't able to serve our customers well with the way that we had to carry those pens, so we just dropped them. We just made that decision. And ultimately, it took a little while, but that distributor ended up dropping the brand anyway. So then Kaweco was just kind of not in the US anymore. Got picked up by another distributor, so now there's another distributor who's carrying it that is stocking a little bit wider of a product line, so that is helping a lot. That's why we have more nib sizes and stuff. We just added the extra fines to all of our offerings, so that's why you're seeing those, is because our distributor is now bringing them in. We're not having to manually swap out nibs and so on, so logistically it's much more feasible for us to offer a better selection. Now you're asking me specifically about some of these other pens. Well, it would be because they're not brought in through a US distributor. So it would mean if we wanted to carry them, we would have to have high minimum quantities with long lead times and wait times to get them from Kaweco in Germany, if we were able to even coordinate that anyway, if our distributor was able to handle that kind of custom ordering workload. And so that's where the logistics really start to kind of kill it. So it may be that some other companies out there are able to manage that, and they are special ordering stuff directly from Germany and are able to do that. That is, based on our previous experience of doing that, that is really, really hard to do, hard to balance all that out. So that's part of why we don't have anything expanded at this time. We've been kind of just adding a little bit here and there as we go. But whether or not something is brought in through a distributor, especially through Kaweco, can really make a big difference in terms of how feasible it is, at least for us, to be able to carry it. Kerry A on Facebook, what kinds of things do you and your team think about when you're considering carrying a new brand or product? So this is a really good question. I honestly felt like I'd answered this already. So when I was going through these questions with Margaret yesterday, it was like, I know I've answered this before. I don't want to answer it again if I've answered it recently. I was like, can you just like comb through the last 10 or 12 Q&As and just look and see if we've answered it? I was like, I can swear that I've answered this fairly recently. Well, she went back and looked through them all and couldn't find it. So it's possible that I've answered it, but honestly, at this point, I've answered over 1,000 questions through our Q&As. So I can't honestly remember myself. I have a pretty decent memory, so I have a pretty good instinct for whether or not I've talked about something or not. But if I can't do it and Margaret can't comb through and find it, then chances are it's probably worth talking about again, because even the process might change, or I might be able to give a little additional insight. You know, the viewership has grown quite a bit, so it may be that a lot of new people that wouldn't go back and look through the old one anyway would just get it new. So I'm going to go ahead and just answer it. So I think it's a pretty compelling question. There are a lot of different factors of why we might carry something here at Goulet. So I'll kind of take you through a little bit of my logic, okay? So one of the first things that I use as a gauge is, are customers asking for it? Is there a buzz about it online? Are we hearing excitement about it? And do we specifically have people saying, hey, can you carry this? Have you heard about this? Can you tell me about this? And if we're not hearing much of anything about it, you know, that might mean that this is not that great of a product, or maybe it's just, it doesn't have a lot of exposure, so it could be indicative of an opportunity for us to share a little bit more about it. But generally speaking, you know, we deal online, so if there is a buzz about something online, we would probably be better off carrying something that people have used and have reviewed and are excited about and are talking about. That's probably what we're going to do better with, as opposed to something that no one's ever heard of. Okay. The next kind of thing we think of, and this isn't necessarily in any specific kind of order, I'm just going kind of a little bit from a higher level going down. Not only do people want it, but is there a hole to be filled, or is this just something that everybody carries and we would just kind of be another commodity? And there will kind of be a correlation. Are people asking us for it versus is it something that they can get just about anywhere? There's a lot of things that we do get asked about, but you can get them anywhere. You know, I'll throw a specific example out there. Black and red notebooks. I think they're pretty decent notebooks, but you can get them at Walmart, you can get them at Office Max, and they're fairly inexpensive. I just don't know what value I might be able to add as a boutique retailer for something that is generally so readily available. You know, there's a reason we don't carry Pilot G2 rollerball pens, because they're available just about everywhere. The way that we as a company got into our niche and where we are was by filling a void, right? And that is what every smart business person does, is they look to serve where people are not being served, and that's how you distinguish yourself. And then you just kill it, and you just you know, crush it like it's never been crushed before, and serve people like they've never been served before, so that you become the go-to resource where there was an opportunity to do so. It's much harder to do that in a very crowded market where everybody's carrying something and it's a commodity. So is there an opportunity for us to be able to serve people well, kind of doing things the way we do it? That's a very important factor. Is the product any good? You know, sometimes there's a lot of hot demand for something, but that's based on pictures or hearsay or rumors, and you actually get the thing in your hand and you're like, oh, this just really isn't that great, or this is good, but it's really not for us, you know? So getting something in our hands is a big deal. You know, we definitely have some things where we get customers that ask us to carry a certain product, and then we get it in our hands and we're like, okay, I can see the appeal, but this pen just, you know, compared to what everything else that we carry, just is really expensive, and I just don't think that we would do that well with it. Or, oh man, you get it in your hand and you're like, holy crap, like this pen is incredible. Why don't people know about it more? And we get really excited about it. That's when things really get exciting. So getting it in our hands is a big deal. Does it excite us? You know, do we get passionate about it, or is it just like, you know, I guess people are asking about it, but I just really don't get it. You know, if we don't get it, then we might try it a little bit here and there, and maybe just like we'll start to get it as we use it more. But generally speaking, if we don't like really get the appeal, we won't carry it, just because it's hard for us to really get excited about something that we just don't understand. a very important one that is often overlooked by a lot of companies is there a values alignment with us and the manufacturer and the distributor? You know, it's not that they have to necessarily have all the same stuff and do everything like we would do it, but if there is a direct, you know, business conflict or a what I would call like a, you know, I guess values would be one way to put it, but just like a worldview difference about doing business or about how a product should be used or its intended purpose or who it serves. If there is a complete conflict with us and who we're buying from, it's not going to work out. Like, we might be able to carry it successfully for a little while, but then we're going to start to create some friction. So, you know, I can't give any specific examples right now, you know, except, you know, like Sailor, for example. There was a direct conflict in our business dealings, which eventually severed the relationship that we had with them. And, you know, no like super hard feelings at that point, but there is just a values difference between the way that they are running things and the way that we wanted to run things that ultimately severed that relationship that we did have for a number of years. So now we definitely factor that in. Now, especially that we have our values defined as a company, and we have a track record for having done well and not well with a variety of products, we can tell that much earlier in the investigation process as to how well a relationship might go based on how we all choose to do things. Let's see here. What else? Is it practical and economical for us to carry? You know, you might have all these other things that factor in, but it might just not make sense. We might have to charge too much, or we might not be able to, you know, logistically carry it, you know, reliably in a proper time frame and stuff like that. That relationship definitely gets strained in some ways. You know, a good example, you know, a tangible example for this one is we get asked about like the TWSBI notebooks. You know, TWSBI came out with notebooks. You know, we investigated it. They seemed pretty exciting, but, you know, with the weight that it is and the shipping cost and everything, essentially they weren't going to make any money and we weren't going to make any money. And as a business person, if you're not making any money doing something, you can only do it but for so long, because you have to keep the lights on and keep the doors open. And, you know, I got a lot of great people on my team, but if I'm not paying them, they're not going to come in the door, but for so long. So it's like there has to be a economical, practical aspect to it. And that kind of stuff gets, you know, that's all very proprietary, and there's a lot of factors that come into play on that one. But there might be certain things that just are not, it doesn't make sense for us logistically behind the scenes to carry something. Other things, is it unique and is it of good value? You know, we don't have a lot of premium priced products here at Goulet because we have a very heavy focus on the educational aspect of things, bringing people into the hobby. I'm a very much of a utilitarian kind of guy, so I like to have a very kind of practical lens on most of the pens. Sometimes I like to get a little kooky, you know, I get excited about the Monteverde Rose Gold or something like that, but that are just not super practical. But, you know, for the most part, we tend to have a very value focused lens on things, so that can come into play as well. And then, you know, the kind of another factor is just, can we handle it right now? And that's really more of a timing thing. There might be products that we get excited about and we're like, we could do well with that pen, but the timing is just not right. We can't devote the proper presentation, education, you know, all those production, if you will, and that's not the right word, the content production, I guess. You know, if I don't have time to shoot a video on it, you know, if we don't have time to photograph it and all that, the timing might just not be right, and we might hold off on it. You know, we've had that with certain products before. You know, other things, it's like, yeah, the timing might really be right. We have to shift the focus on some things, turn some other things down, push other things out to have more of a focus on this thing. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that comes into play too. So in general, there's a lot of different factors, and they all kind of come into play. We have lots of meetings, lots of discussions about all those things with our whole team about those, but that might give you just a little bit of insight into some of what goes into everything. I guess to summarize it all, you can see that there's a lot that goes into whether or not a product's right for us. We tend to be pretty selective. We're pretty picky. We don't just like, well, let's throw it on the site and see how it does. It's really not what we do. Question from Matthew Flick at Inky Wrist on Twitter. What was the first pen ordered from the Goulet Pen Company? And this is a really interesting question. I don't remember ever being asked this before. So if I had to really think back, I mean, obviously the first pen ever ordered from the Goulet pen company would be a Goulet pen, because that was our background that we had. Now it depends on like how you define which like version of our business that we had. Originally, for the first 3 years of our business, it was all pens that I handmade, hand turned out of wood and acrylics and stuff like that. It was all roller balls and a few ballpoints and models that wouldn't accept the roller ball. But for the most part, rollerball pens. I didn't know anything about fountain pens when we first got into it. I discovered that in 2009. We started doing this pen turning thing in 2007. So there was definitely, you know, a Goulet pens. For the first, I sold like 900 of those that I made myself. So that would be technically the first pen sold from the Goulet pen company would be a Goulet pen, and I don't remember specifically which one. We did have a corporate order that kind of like got us off the ground initially, so it'd probably be just any one of those. It wouldn't be one specific pen that sold first. It would be any one from that large order. So if you're talking specifically about like fountain pens, so like once we hit November 17th, 2009, that's technically what we consider our anniversary date for the business in its current form. That's when we got our first shipment of ink and paper, and we didn't sell commercially made fountain pens for a while. But I did, from my rollerball pen making days, I did have some like, it had like interchangeable kit parts that you could use into the pressed like wood bodies and stuff. So I had some roller balls and I just like swapped out the parts to convert them over to fountain pens, to a cartridge converter fountain pen. So I guess technically one of those would have been the first Goulet fountain pen that was ever sold. I don't specifically remember which one, nor do I have a record of that. So I can't answer that for you exactly. But if you want to consider, so there's like several different categories you could have. If you want to consider like commercially made, commercially readily available fountain pen, which is really what I would consider to be in its current form, I actually don't know which the first pen. It would either be a Pelican Script, which we don't carry anymore, just it was kind of like a low-end calligraphy pen, or a Platinum Preppy, because those are what got our foot in the door. We had like no money when we started this business, so we couldn't even afford to carry a pen like a Lamy Safari even. You know, we didn't have the reputation built yet to carry like a big name brand like Lamy or Pilot or whatever. We had to earn our place with those distributors and manufacturers to even be able to be offered, because even in 2009, 2010, it was pretty sketchy as an online retailer, especially in the fountain pen world. We had to build a lot of trust before we could get into those bigger brands. So, so Pelican, I guess, yeah, definitely is a reputable brand, but their lower end stuff, they're not as picky about. So we got into some scripts at first. Those were some of the first pens that I used and loved. And then the Platinum ones, you know, Platinum and Noodlers are distributed by the same company. So Platinum, we got into their stuff. There's not much in between. Now there's like the Balance and the Cool and stuff like that. But really, back then when we first started carrying it, it was pretty much the Preppy. And then from there, you went up to the 3776, which is this gold nib. It was like 150 something at the time. Its price has gone up a little bit since then, but it was like a huge leap. So it was like, all right, we got the Preppy. That's it. There were no Noodler's Flex pens at that time. Noodler's hadn't made any pen as of that time. It was only just Platinum. So that we really eased into things as we first got into it. So there you go. All right, so I just got a couple of questions left here, some troubleshooting questions to round out the Q&A. I got a question from Jane Pilecki, at Pilecki Jane on Twitter. I hope I pronounced that right. Why does my Lamy 2000 squeak when writing? I have an Edison and a Pelican that do as well. That's really interesting to me. I don't know why exactly you're having that issue with those pens. I actually don't hear about a squeak problem with those very often. I have experienced a squeak for myself a little bit. Oddly enough, with the broad Falcon nibs, I tend to see squeaking a lot more. I don't know exactly why. I think it's because, you know, if you've got a metal nib and you've got paper, the metal on paper actually creates friction. So there is a resistance to it. So if you think about, you know, when you have a tuning fork or something like that, or even just like a spoon or a kettle or something, when you bang it, it's going to clang, it's going to resonate because metal vibrates, it moves. So what happens when you have this nib and you're moving it on the paper, if you look very microscopically at the paper, paper is actually fairly rough looking. So as you're moving a nib across the page, it's creating a slight bit of resonance. Usually it's not enough where you actually hear anything, but it certainly can happen. So I don't know if it's just, if to have like 3 different pens like that do it, I don't know if it's just like you're just doing a lot of things right in quotations, so that it's allowing that resonance to happen audibly. That's just really interesting. So I don't know. I don't really know exactly what's causing it. One thing that I've found that has helped for me when I have had that happen is hitting it with a little bit of Mylar paper. So just basically knocking off a little bit of the toothiness of that nib can help to smooth it out a little bit, and then the nib doesn't vibrate quite as much and gets rid of that audible squeak. Especially if you're getting a squeak in like a certain direction or always in a certain like loop in your letter, repeating that where you're getting the squeak on the Mylar, not doing it heavily, just very lightly, but that can help knock it down. Or if you don't have Mylar paper, one thing that can kind of help a little bit is using a brown paper bag. And I don't like to say that a lot because it sounds really bad, and you can, if you've got really nice pens, like maybe don't try it quite as much, but there's not a lot of harm that can be done. You're not trying to gouge the paper, but just very lightly. The brown paper bag can give a little bit of resistance and kind of smooth out, just hit it enough to where it won't squeak anymore. So that might be something you could try out. It's really hard to do a lot of damage with a brown paper bag, so I think you would be okay. And it might be that some paper is doing it more than others. Try experimenting on different paper just to see for yourself if that makes a difference, and some inks maybe. But either way, it's very interesting that you're having that happen. There's something going on there that's kind of neat. Last question I've got is from Ben Wilson at WilsonBT34 on Twitter. I have a couple of eyedroppers that are really hard starters. Is there any way to prime the feed somehow? It does get tough with eyedroppers because you can't, it's not like a cartridge converter or a piston where you can just kind of like force more ink down in there. So you are a little more limited in being able to prime an eyedropper pen. But the first thing I would do is check to make sure that your pen actually has ink in it. Okay, if it's an eyedropper that's a clear one that's easy to see, that's good. But an eyedropper could be the kind of thing like you're writing with it and you don't realize that it's almost out of ink, and then it is. So that's the first thing to check. It's kind of like make sure that the TV's plugged in and the power button is on kind of, suggestion, but just, make sure your pen has ink in it, first of all. And there's several ways you can prime it. First off, it could be hard starting because it needs to be cleaned. Especially if it's an eyedropper pen, you fill it once in a while and you don't really think about it. It could dry out over time, and stuff could dry up in your nib. It could just be that you're using it, and I would think an eyedropper pen is something that you would be refilling with the same ink more and more ongoing. So it could be that just some regular pen maintenance is needed. Check out Fountain Pen 101, pen cleaning and maintenance video. That'll help you out. But if you actually want to get to the point where it's like, all right, I know I've taken care of all that stuff, I just need to prime it up. There's a couple different ways you can do it, and this is not just for eyedroppers. You can use it for basically any fountain pen, but the eyedropper is a little more restricted to just these methods. So there are some ways you can do it. You can, if you have your bottle of ink that you're filling that pen with handy, just dipping the nib back into that ink can help to saturate that feed again, get that capillary action restored, and be able to write again. So that is one way that can help. If you don't have your bottle of ink, just getting the nib wet itself and just getting water in there can help. So just whether you got a faucet and you just drip a little bit of ink on there, or you got a little Dixie cup of water or something that you can just toss because it's going to get inky. You don't want to use it in like your nice coffee mug because it'd be harder to clean out. But just getting a little bit of water on there, and then you should be able to get that thing primed up and going again. Of course, your ink would look a little watery at first, so you'd have to make some scribbles on a separate piece of paper, but then you'd be able to get it going again, especially if the nib is kind of dried out a little bit. Another thing you can do is you can wick it through your nib and your feed with, I keep thinking I'm going to knock this over, but it like has these stops on the back. You can wick it through with a tissue or a paper towel. If it's a tissue especially, those tend to be kind of fibrous. You don't want to like rub too much because you're going to get junk all over your nib, but just something to help to soak and encourage it to come through. And the last one is this technique that I learned that you can do to help kind of literally like mechanically force ink down through your pen. Normally when you're writing with your pen, your nib is going to be down here, sort of where the bottom of your hand is. If you kind of take the pen and hold it further up in your hand so that you're not going to hit the nib on anything, if you hold the nib up like that and then you kind of bang your hand down on your desk, it's going to kind of like like jar the ink and kind of force it down through the feed. And if you do that enough so that it actually even splatters out a little bit, then you know that thing is primed up pretty well, ready to go. And you could use a blend of some of these techniques if you want to, like bam, 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 a little bit of water, wick it with a paper towel, then write with it. Some of those things if you really got to get it going. But you can vary any of these techniques depending on what your situation is and all that. You know, if you're in a meeting, you don't want to be sitting there like this, splattering ink all over the place because you're going to look like a maniac. And it's already hard enough for us fountain pen crazy folk to, you know, justify our ridiculous hobby to those who don't understand it. You don't need to be going in there and acting a fool in the middle of a meeting, but, you know, obviously use some of that. And the last thing I'm going to say is, you know, carry a backup pen just in case you run into that kind of situation. Some of these methods with getting the ink started again, well, pretty much all of them involve some kind of, you know, loud or, you know, whatever action that is going to draw some attention or not be super practical depending on where you are. So it's always good just to keep a backup pen if you are going to be in that situation when you really need to have a pen. So that's it for this week. Hope you enjoyed this one. I got a good question of the week for you this week, pulling out from one of the earlier questions I had in here. Where do you go for your fountain pen info if you're not getting it from me or from gouletpens.com or one of our social channels? I'm very curious to know, what are your favorite places to go and find non-Goulet pen related information? I'd love to hear. So thank you so much for watching this week. I'm excited to see you next week as well. Be sure to ask questions on YouTube or on Twitter or on Facebook or on the blog. We're looking at all these channels now, trying to gather up as much good information and questions as we can. I'm very encouraged by the amount of content, amount of questions that's coming in. I'm very sorry that I can't specifically address everybody's questions each week, but I will always try my best. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, a great rest of your week. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you have not already, and right on.